In the early 1990s, something extraordinary was happening in Europe. The Cold War had ended, the Iron Curtain had fallen, and countries that had lived under communism for decades were suddenly being told they were free. Free to vote, free to speak, free to own property. But freedom came with a problem. No one had ever explained how capitalism actually worked. Czechoslovakia was one of those countries. For more than 40 years, the state had owned everything: factories, land, housing, industry. Ordinary people didn't own shares. They didn't own businesses. They owned jobs. And almost overnight, the government decided to change all of that. They would privatize the entire economy, not slowly, not carefully, all at once. The plan was called voucher privatization. On paper, it sounded fair, almost utopian. Every adult citizen would receive vouchers, coupons that could be exchanged for shares in newly privatized companies, steel plants, breweries, energy firms, banks. Instead of selling national assets to foreign corporations or political elites, the government would turn citizens into shareholders. Everyone would become an investor. Everyone would get a piece. But there was a problem no one wanted to talk about. Most people had no idea what a share was. They didn't know how markets worked. They didn't know how to evaluate companies. They didn't know how to protect themselves. And in that confusion, opportunity was waiting. He didn't look like a villain. He was young, charismatic, well-spoken. And unlike most of the people around him, he understood capitalism very, very well. Viktor Kožený had grown up in Czechoslovakia, but he had left early. He studied abroad. He saw the West. He absorbed how money really moved. And when he returned, he saw something no one else did. An entire country about to hand over its wealth without knowing how to defend it. He didn't force anyone. He didn't steal anything outright. Instead, he made a promise, a very simple one. Kožený told ordinary citizens they didn't need to worry about learning markets or picking companies. They could trust him. If they handed their vouchers to his investment funds, he promised extraordinary returns, sometimes claiming he would deliver 10 times their investment. It sounded unbelievable, but it also sounded hopeful. And hope is powerful when you're coming out of decades of scarcity. People lined up: factory workers, teachers, pensioners. Millions of vouchers flowed into Kožený's funds. To many citizens, he didn't look like a predator. He looked like a guide. Here's the part that matters. Kožený wasn't lying about everything. At first, his strategy was legal. He understood loopholes in the privatization process. He understood voting rights tied to shares. He understood how to gain control without owning outright. While citizens thought they were investing, Kožený was consolidating power. Quietly, methodically. And soon, he wasn't just managing funds. He was controlling companies. Some economists warned that voucher privatization could be exploited. Some journalists raised questions about Kožený's methods. But the country was drunk on optimism. This was capitalism. This was the future. And Viktor Kožený looked like its first success story. Here's the question no one stopped to ask at the time. If millions of people hand over control of their assets to one man, who is really free? By the time regulators began paying attention, it was already too late. Kožený had built something enormous, and he was just getting started. Viktor Kožený didn't invent chaos. He learned how to operate inside it. Because voucher privatization wasn't just generous, it was structurally vulnerable. And Kožený understood the structure better than almost anyone else. Each citizen's vouchers represented potential ownership in hundreds of companies. But managing those choices required financial literacy, time, confidence. Most people had none of those. Kožený offered a shortcut, not education, not empowerment, convenience. He created investment funds that looked legitimate. They had offices, staff, marketing materials, legal registration. To ordinary citizens, it felt safe. And crucially, it felt official. This wasn't a man on the street making promises. This was a man operating within the system. Citizens transferred their vouchers to Kožený's funds. In return, they received shares in the fund itself. On paper, they were now investors. In reality, they had surrendered control. Here's where the design flaw mattered. The privatization system allowed fund managers to vote shares on behalf of investors. That meant Kožený could influence company boards, block decisions, install loyal leadership, all without technically owning the majority. And as more vouchers came in, that power compounded. Factories, breweries, utilities, entire sectors quietly moved under his influence. From the outside, nothing illegal was happening. Funds were allowed. Voting rights were legal. Consolidation was expected. This was capitalism working. Or so it seemed. What regulators underestimated wasn't the legality. It was the speed. Kožený moved faster than the system could react. By the time one company was reviewed, he already controlled 3 more. And while bureaucrats debated frameworks, Kožený executed. Kožený didn't present himself as a ruthless financier. He played the role of a reformist, someone helping the country modernize, someone who spoke the language of Western investors and local citizens alike. He gave interviews. He smiled easily. He dismissed critics as pessimists who didn't understand markets. And for a while, the results supported him. Some companies improved. Stock prices rose. That success bought silence. This is where the story widens. Kožený didn't just want Czech companies. He wanted credibility. And credibility, in the 1990s, came from one place: the United States. Through intermediaries and advisors, Kožený connected with American investors, names that carried weight, institutions that symbolized rigor and legitimacy. Among them were funds linked to Harvard University. For Kožený, this wasn't just capital, it was validation. If Harvard-backed entities were involved, how bad could it be? That single association reassured thousands of people who had doubts. And it reassured regulators too. With foreign capital added to domestic vouchers, Kožený's influence exploded. Companies weren't just controlled, they were leveraged. Assets were shifted. Cash was moved. Complex structures emerged. To outsiders, it looked sophisticated. To insiders, it was becoming opaque. Employees inside some companies noticed changes. Decisions stopped making sense. Resources vanished. Debt appeared where there had been none. But tracing responsibility was difficult. Ownership structures were layered. Decision-making was centralized. And Kožený remained insulated. At what point does smart capitalism turn into extraction? Because Kožený's system didn't require companies to succeed long-term. It required control. And control was already secured. By the mid-1990s, Viktor Kožený was no longer a rising star. He was a kingmaker. And the wealth he commanded was no longer theoretical. It was real. The machine was running. and it was about to leave the country behind. Once Viktor Kožený had control, the goal quietly changed. This was no longer about fixing companies or building long-term value. It became about movement. Control opened doors. Boards answered to him. Executives deferred to him. Oversight weakened. And inside that silence, money began to move. Not always dramatically, often quietly, piece by piece. Fees here, loans there. Asset transfers justified by restructuring. Each decision could be explained in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. Kožený understood something crucial. You don't move money once, you move it layer by layer. Companies owned other companies. Funds invested in subsidiaries. Subsidiaries paid consultants. Tracing cash required time. And time was the one thing regulators never had enough of. Western investors assumed complexity meant sophistication. Local investors assumed someone was in charge. Both assumptions were wrong. As money flowed outward, American-linked funds found themselves exposed. Not because they intended fraud, but because they trusted structure over scrutiny. Reports were delayed. Explanations were technical. Warnings were softened. And every time questions arose, Kožený had an answer. He spoke their language. American investors were used to rules that eventually worked. Czech regulators were still building theirs. Kožený lived in the gap between those worlds. He knew how to reassure Americans and outmaneuver locals. By the time some companies began to fail, the damage was already done. Factories couldn't pay suppliers. Banks questioned loans. Workers sensed instability. But blaming Kožený was difficult. He wasn't on payrolls. He wasn't signing daily checks. He existed above the chaos. Early investigations focused on outcomes. Why did this company collapse? Why did this fund underperform? But those weren't the right questions. The right question was simpler. Where did the money go? And no one yet had the answer. Inside financial circles, tone changed. Emails became cautious. Meetings grew tense. What once felt like innovation now felt like exposure. Still, pulling out wasn't easy. Too much was already committed. And admitting failure meant admitting responsibility. As scrutiny increased, Kožený accelerated. Assets were sold. Positions were unwound. Cash was repositioned. By the time institutions realized what was happening, the structure they trusted had already thinned. For many investors, it came too late. They weren't victims of a single theft. They were victims of delay in oversight, delay in skepticism, delay in acting when warning signs appeared. Kožený didn't outrun the law. He outran the clock. Even as Czech authorities circled closer, Kožený's attention had shifted. He wasn't planning to fix the fallout. He was planning something bigger, something global, something that made Czech companies look small. And somewhere far from Prague, oil-rich and politically fragile, another opportunity was waiting. The money had left, and the story was about to follow it. By the late 1990s, Viktor Kožený was no longer thinking like a fund manager. He was thinking like a gambler. The Czech Republic had been a proving ground, a place to learn how systems break under pressure. But the real prize, the kind that could eclipse everything before it, lay elsewhere. In energy, in geopolitics, in oil. Oil isn't just a commodity. It's leverage. Control oil, and you influence governments, currencies, and futures. One successful deal could erase losses, silence critics, and restore Kožený's image overnight. And there was one place where opportunity and instability overlapped perfectly. Azerbaijan. Fresh from the collapse of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan was rich in oil. State assets were being privatized. Power was concentrated. Rules were flexible, if you knew who to talk to. Kožený and his partners would acquire control of Azerbaijan's state oil company through privatization. Not slowly, not cautiously, decisively. And once secured, the payoff would be enormous. But this time, vouchers and legal loopholes wouldn't be enough. This deal required something else: influence. According to later indictments, Kožený and his associates planned to pay bribes to senior Azerbaijani officials to secure favorable privatization outcomes. Millions of dollars, not hidden in suitcases, but routed through intermediaries, offshore accounts, and consulting agreements. This wasn't speculation. It would later become the core of U.S. criminal charges. At some point, conversations were recorded. In them, Kožený allegedly spoke openly about payments, leverage, and expectations. Whether he believed the recordings would never surface, or whether he underestimated the consequences, remains unclear. But once those tapes existed, the story changed forever. Once again, American investors were involved. Once again, legitimacy preceded scrutiny. Funds were raised. Promises were made. Documents were signed. And once again, speed outran caution. The Azerbaijani privatization didn't go as planned. Political winds shifted. Officials changed positions. And suddenly, the door slammed shut. The oil prize disappeared, but the money did not return. This time, regulators didn't hesitate. The allegations crossed a line. This wasn't aggressive capitalism. It was alleged bribery of foreign officials. When the charges came down, Kožený wasn't in Prague. He wasn't in New York. He was in the Bahamas, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States, a place where legal battles move slowly, if at all. The transformation was complete. The man once praised as a symbol of post-communist success was now officially a fugitive. By the time Viktor Kožený settled into life in the Bahamas, the world he had built was collapsing behind him. Investigators retraced years of transactions, interviews, and missed warnings. What once looked like innovation now looked like intent. For years, many victims stayed silent. Some out of embarrassment, some out of fear, some because they still believed the money might return. But silence doesn't heal loss. Gradually, lawsuits emerged from Czech citizens, from institutional investors, from funds that once believed they were protected by structure and reputation. Kožený wasn't hiding in shadows. He lived openly. He gave interviews. He hired lawyers. He fought back in court. He denied wrongdoing. To him, this wasn't criminal behavior. It was business misunderstood by people who arrived too late.